the invisible frontier. That day, everything seemed normal until suddenly it was no longer there. My son had woken up with a high fever and complaining of severe pain in his stomach. It was the kind of situation that makes us leave everything and run to the hospital. Took the car key, threw a bottle of water in the backpack and put it on the back seat, still half sleepy. As soon as I left the garage, I realized something strange. The phone lost signal. It was not the first time that happened in the neighborhood, so I just whispered of what a pain and continued driving. But then, just turning into the main street, I felt something strange. It was as if the air around me had become heavier. My hands were sweating and I started feeling discomfort, but I ignored it. After all, my focus was to get to the hospital as soon as possible. It was when I reached the end of the street that the stranger became scared. My vision began to become blurry, as if I was very tired or dizzy. My head weighed, my chest was tight, and I felt a weakness that I could not explain. Instinctively, I stopped the car at the side of the road, thinking it was something with me, maybe low pressure or stress. I looked back to see how my son was, and he seemed uncomfortable too, holding his head and complaining that it was all weird. I tried to come home, but the feeling disappeared as soon as I turned the car back. At the time, I thought it was just a coincidence, so I took a deep breath and tried again. Only this time, it was worse. I barely passed the same point, and my whole body seemed to want to turn off. My heart popped, and my instinct was screaming for me to come back. Something didn't let us leave that place. I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm, but my mind was already starting to spin. Turned the car back on, and thought about going around for another exit of the neighborhood. Maybe it was just a problem in my body reacting to the situation, or perhaps something in the air at that particular point. I did my best not to let my son realize that I was getting nervous. I went to the entrance of the main avenue, but when I came close to crossing the boundary of the neighborhood, it happened again. The pressure in my chest returned, my vision began to blur, and it seemed that the steering wheel would slip from my hands, so weak they were. This time I was a few meters away from crossing, but my body simply could not bear to continue. It was as if something invisible pushed me back. I backed, breathing fast, and as soon as I moved away from that area, everything went back to normal. It made no sense. Came home with my heart beating 1,000 and put my son on the couch. He looked a little better, perhaps just because he was away from that horrible feeling. I decided to ask for help. I called a neighbor who lived a few streets down and explained what was happening. He answered something that made me shiver. "Man, I tried to leave earlier today too, but I felt bad near the exit. I thought it was just in my head." The conversation was interrupted by another call, this time from a friend who lives down the street. She was desperate, saying her husband had tried to leave for work and collapsed as soon as she got close to the exit. It wasn't a coincidence. I knew something was very wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. And worse, nobody seemed to have an explanation. After these calls, I started to get really scared. I opened the window of the room and looked at the street. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but if you looked carefully, you could see that something was wrong. The cars that usually left for work at that time were all parked, and some people were on the sidewalks, talking with confused expressions. I took my cell phone and tried to call the hospital, the police, anything that could help me understand what was going on, but the phone did not complete the call. The Wi-Fi was working, so I sent some messages to groups on WhatsApp asking if anyone had news about a block or something. The answers that came were even more disturbing. No one outside the neighborhood seemed to know anything. At that moment, I decided to walk out of the house. I needed to understand what was happening, and maybe walking I could see something that would explain that strange feeling. The weather was muggy, as if it were raining, but the sky was clear. With each step towards the end of the street, the same pressure I felt in the car started to come back. Only this time it seemed worse. My legs started to get heavy, as if I were walking against a strong wind, even without any wind. When I came close to the corner, I felt a sharp kick in my head so strong that I had to lean on the wall of a house. My heart was racing, as if I had been running for hours. I could not take another step. I came back slowly, almost dragging myself, and as soon as I walked into my street, the weight disappeared, as if nothing had happened. When I came home, I didn't know what else to do. My son was lying on the couch with a high fever, and I needed help. I decided to try again. I took the car keys and left. But this time, before I got to the main street, I noticed something that had gone unnoticed before. Some people were outside their houses, all with the same expression of disorientation. One of the neighbors, Mr. Mariano, waved at me. He looked pale, and I asked if he was okay. "It's as if the air outside is wrong," he said, his voice hoarse. He explained that he tried to drive into town in the morning, but had to come back when he started having chest pains. "There's something holding us here," he added, looking at me with a mixture of fear and confusion. I decided to follow the entrance of the neighborhood again, but this time I paid more attention. The streets were quieter than usual, as if everyone was afraid to leave home. When I got close to the same curve where my body had given in before, the effect started again. The vision was blurred, my muscles lost strength, and I almost hit the car trying to turn back. The strange thing was that as soon as I moved away from that point, everything disappeared like magic. When I parked the car in front of my house, I noticed that more neighbors had left and were standing looking towards the exit of the neighborhood. Nobody said anything, but their silence and expression spoke for themselves. It was as if everyone knew that something invisible and uncontrollable was holding us there, but no one had the courage to admit. As I tried to think about what to do, a strange feeling took hold of me. It was not only fear, but something deeper, as if that was not just a coincidence. I went to the neighbors' gathering and started talking with a lady named Dona Marta, who had lived there for decades. She was visibly shaken and said that never had seen anything like it. "The clock stopped working when I tried to leave," she said, pointing at her wrist. "It all started when the light blinked in the morning. Didn't you notice?" I really hadn't noticed, but other people started to confirm that their devices were weird early on. It was as if there were a pattern, but no one could explain what it was. Suddenly someone shouted. It was Mariano, who had decided to test the exit on foot again. Everyone turned to see him falling on his knees near the same point where I had stopped before. He seemed to fight his own body, holding his chest and trying to come back. We ran to help him, but as soon as we got close, it was like an invisible wall pushing us back. It was not wind, it was not physical strength, but something I can't describe until today. We felt as if we were being suffocated by a pressure that only stopped when we moved away from the place. Mariano managed to crawl back, but he was pale and breathless, mumbling something that no one could understand. That confirmed what we had already feared. No one could get out. After helping Mariano to return home, the tension in the neighborhood only increased. People began to gather in small groups on the sidewalks, exchanging theories. Some said it was a gas leak, others that it was some radiation from the city. But nothing made sense. A younger boy, Pedro, tried to use a drone to see what was beyond the point where everyone stopped. But as soon as the equipment crossed the area, the connection fell off and the drone crashed into the ground as if it had been turned off. It made everyone even more nervous. I started to feel a kind of paranoia that I can't explain. It was as if somehow that place was alive, aware of what we were trying to do. Later, when the sun began to set, the silence became almost unbearable. The air seemed denser, heavier, as if something was approaching. Suddenly the street lights flickered, and the pole in front of my house went out. My breathing accelerated, and I saw that some people noticed too. Nobody wanted to admit it out loud, but everyone was looking at the same point. The curve where Mariano fell first. Something in that direction made my stomach turn, as if my body knew what was there, but my mind refused to accept it. I stood there looking, waiting for something that I did not know what it was. But nothing happened, or at least not in a way that could be seen. With the darkness taking hold, most people started to come into their homes, but I stayed on the porch. Something in me could not simply ignore what was happening. Got a flashlight and decided to take a short walk in the street, more to keep my head busy than for any other reason. As I walked, the silence made me restless. There was no sound of cars, barking dogs, or even the wind in the trees. It was as if everything around me had been turned off. I went to the end of the street and looked towards the curve again. It seemed like any other day, but there was something in that area that made my whole body tense, as if I was being watched. Suddenly I heard a noise behind me. It was like fast steps, but when I turned around there was no one. My flashlight started to flash, and the sweat was running down my face. I tried not to panic, but the sound continued, closer and closer. I ran back home, my heart pounding, but upon arrival I realized that I was not the only one who had heard something strange. Dona Marta was standing at her window, wide-eyed, pointing to the street. "Did you see?" she asked, almost without a voice. I nodded, but deep down I knew something was out there. It wasn't imaginary, and I wasn't the only one feeling it. The box in the field. That day, I and two other friends went to help clear the field behind the school. It was a kind of abandoned space, full of high bush and rubble, but the idea was to make it ready for some sports activity. At first, everything seemed normal. We would weed, throw away old cans, and stack up wood in a corner. It was then that Paul, one of my friends, cried. He had found something strange buried under a pile of boards. When we approached, we saw that it was a wooden box, well worn, full of dust, and with some marks that seemed like symbols, but nothing very clear. Out of curiosity, we started trying to open it. I remember that Paolo had to use a stone to force the lid, because it was completely jammed. When we finally opened, we did not expect to find what was inside. There were a lot of old photos, all in black and white, but what caught our attention was that some of them show places we knew about the city, only with a much darker air. In addition, there were letters, handwritten, with elegant calligraphy, but the content was disturbing. They talked about secrets of the people here, things that no one should know. At first, we thought it was some kind of joke or maybe a forgotten school project, but the information seemed very personal. One of the letters mentioned something that Paolo's mother had lived with years ago, something he didn't even know. It made us all uncomfortable, but the curiosity was stronger, and we ended up taking the box with us to look better later. We took the box to Paolo's garage, which was further away from his house. There, we started to search the contents more calmly. Each letter seemed to tell a story or reveal something that someone would probably prefer to keep secret. Some were shocking, like one that talked about a car accident that happened years ago and was supposedly caused intentionally. Another mentions an extramarital affair involving people who still lived in the city. As we read, the feeling of discomfort increased. I remember looking at Paolo and realizing that he was restless, as if something inside those letters was stirring with him. The strange thing was that none of them had a date, but the paper looked very old, as if they were there for decades. It was then that I felt for the first time that feeling of being observed. I can't explain it right, but it was as if there was someone in the garage door, even though they knew it was closed. I looked around, trying to ignore the shiver in the back of my head, but the feeling didn't go away. A noise coming from outside the garage made me get up at the time. It was as if someone had stepped on something, a dry snap. Paul and his other friend, Luke, also stopped what they were doing and looked in the same direction. We were silent, trying to hear anything else, but nothing happened. Deep down, I wanted to believe that it was just an animal or something, but the feeling of being watched got even stronger. After that noise, none of us wanted to admit we were scared, but we could see in everyone's face that something was wrong. Paolo tried to pretend that everything was fine and started to put the letters back in the box, saying we should stop messing with them for now. But before he finished, one of the pictures fell to the ground and Lucas took it to look. He stood there, holding the photo, with an expression I will never forget. "This here is my house," he said almost in a whisper. I went to him to look, and it really looked. Only that what made me shiver was the detail. In the photo, the house had something strange, like a shadow on the window, which looked like a person looking out. "There's no one at home now. My mom is at work," he muttered, putting the picture back in with his hands shaking. We decided to lock the box and store it right there in Paolo's garage. None of us wanted to take that home. We went out to try to cool our heads, but that feeling of being watched kept on with me. As we walked back to the city center, I noticed that Paul looked back often, as if he expected to see someone following us. I asked what was going on, but he just shook his head, saying it was nothing. I knew he was lying. At that moment, we were all suspicious, but no one wanted to say out loud what they were really thinking, that there was something wrong with that box. When I got home, I tried to get on with my day, but things started getting worse. Later that night, everything was apparently quiet at home. I tried to watch TV to distract myself, but my mind kept returning to the box, to the photos, and especially to that letter that mentioned the accident that happened near my street years ago. I remember hearing my parents talk about it at the time, but never with as much detail as what was in the letter. Meanwhile, it seemed that the whole house was quieter than normal, as if the silence was gradually increasing. That's when my phone vibrated. It was a message in the group I had with Paolo and Lucas. Paul had taken a picture of the box, still locked in the garage, and sent with the message, "Someone has moved it. I have frozen." He said the box was in a different place from where we had left it, and one of the letters was on the floor, as if someone had opened it and read. "Nobody came in here, I'm sure," he insisted. As I read the messages, I felt a shiver run through my spine. I went to look out the window, just to make sure everything was normal, but something made me hesitate. Outside, the street was empty, as always at night, but I swear I saw a shadow moving near the sidewalk. I blinked a few times, trying to see better, but there was nothing else. It was as if my mind was playing with me. I decided to close all the windows and lock the doors, but the feeling that something was wrong didn't go away. Shortly after, another message arrived in the group, this time from Lucas. He said that he had heard footsteps in his backyard. I thought it was my mother, but she hasn't come home from work yet, he wrote. It didn't take long for him to send a photo of the bedroom window, showing the empty lawn, but the grass looked crumpled, as if someone had actually passed by there. Paul replied that his garage was locked, but he continued with the feeling that something or someone was nearby. I didn't know what to say. That irrational fear that started in the field behind the school now seemed to be chasing us, as if we had taken something from that box with us, even without realizing. Then something very strange happened to me too. I was going into the room when I realized that there was something on the floor of the room. It was a picture. I didn't know where she came from, but I recognized her at the time. It was one of the pictures in the box. My heart popped. Took the photo carefully and saw that it showed the facade of my house, but not as it was now. It looked older, with a broken window upstairs, a window that, as far as I knew, had never been damaged. I could not stop looking at the photo, trying to understand how it had stopped there. I was sure that no one but me had entered the house since I came back from the field. It could only mean one thing: someone or something was watching us. After finding the picture, I started walking around the house trying to find some logical explanation. I checked all the doors and windows, but they were locked. The place looked exactly as I had left it, but that picture in the room gave me a strange feeling, like something invisible was there with me. I took my phone and sent a message to Paolo and Lucas, telling them what had happened. Paul answered almost immediately, saying that another letter had appeared outside his garage, although everything was locked. He sent a photo. The letter was about an old secret from one of his neighbors, something that clearly should not have come out of the box. By this time, we were sure that moving that thing had been the worst possible mistake. While reading their messages, my phone started to drain very fast, even though it was with a full battery. Before he hung up, I got another message from Lucas. Someone is knocking on my door. My stomach turned at the time. He said that he was locked in the room and that the beats were loud and rhythmic, as if anyone outside wanted him to know that he was there. I answered to it not open at all, but I could not hear anything more. My phone died. The silence inside the house became so heavy that I could hear the sound of my own heart. I decided it was better to try and get out, but the moment I opened the front door, I felt that shiver again, as if being watched. There was no one outside, but you could feel that I wasn't alone. I quickly closed the door, my heart pounding, and leaned against it, trying to understand what was happening. The feeling of being observed was stronger and stronger, almost suffocating. Went up to my room and looked out the window, but the street was empty, as if the world outside had just stopped. Couldn't stop thinking about what Lucas had said, about the banging on his door. I decided to try the phone again, but it didn't answer, as if he had just died. Then I heard a noise coming from the corridor. It was a low sound, as if something had fallen, but enough to make me freeze. Took a flashlight and went to check, thinking that maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks. When I got to the hall, I saw something that left me paralyzed. On the floor, right in the middle of the way, there was another letter. Don't know where it came from, because I was sure the door and windows were closed. I picked up the letter carefully, and the words in it to me made me feel a chill in my spine. It was a short but clear message. You opened the wrong door. My stomach turned. Didn't know what that meant, but it seemed like a kind of warning or threat. At that moment, I heard footsteps coming from downstairs, slow steps, as if someone was exploring the house. I was frozen, not knowing what to do. My instinct was to not go down, but the sound of steps seemed to approach the ladder. I have never felt so much fear in my life. I was paralyzed in the hallway, trying to control my breath as the steps got closer. They were firm but slow, as if anyone down there knew exactly where they were going. As much as my instinct screamed for me to be quiet, I decided to move. I walked into my room and locked the door, pushing a chair against it as if that could really protect me. I took my landline phone, which I rarely used, and tried to call the police. There was no signal. The line was dead, and the silence on the other side only made my heart beat faster. It was then that the steps stopped. I was still trying to hear any other sound, but everything was quiet. Too quiet. Then I heard a very low, almost imperceptible sound coming from the corridor. A breath. It was as if someone were standing right outside the door waiting. Don't know where I got the courage, but I lit the flashlight and pointed at the crack under the door. I saw nothing, but the feeling that there was something there did not disappear. After a time that seemed like an eternity, the breath stopped, but soon I heard a sound that made me freeze to the bone. A paper being pushed under the door. It was more of a letter. With my hands shaking, I took the paper and read the message. "You brought this here." At that moment, I realized it wouldn't stop. Not while the box was still there. I couldn't take my eyes off that letter. The words seemed to dance in my head. "You brought this here." It was as if, somehow, it was my fault. Everything that happened that day began to make sense. The feeling of being watched, the messages appearing, the steps in the house. It was the box. We had touched something that we should not, and now it seemed that it was chasing us. Didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to get out of there. I took a deep breath and opened the door of the room slowly. The corridor was empty, but the feeling of being watched did not disappear. I took the car keys and decided to go back to Paolo's house. We needed to solve this together. Drive through the city in complete silence. The streets were dark, but it wasn't just the lack of light. There was something in the air, a kind of emptiness that made everything more strange. When I arrived at Paolo's house, I noticed that the lights in the garage were on. I knocked on the door several times, but nobody answered. I decided to go in, and that's when I realized the box was no longer there. The place where we had left it was empty, and there were papers scattered on the floor, as if someone had moved everything. Paolo's phone was on the floor, with the screen broken, but he was nowhere. A shiver ran through my body. The feeling that we were not dealing with something common was now a certainty. I stood there in the middle of the empty garage, trying to understand what was happening. The box was gone, Paolo disappeared, and the silence in that place was deafening. I took his phone from the floor, but it was unusable. The messages we exchanged earlier, they were spinning in my head. He knew something was wrong, but I never thought it would come to this point. I felt a strong shiver and looked around, trying to find any sign of where he might have gone. It was then that I noticed something I had not seen before. Marks on the floor like scratches, going from the garage towards the field behind the house. Followed those marks with hesitant steps, the flashlight trembling in my hand. When I reached the end of the field, I saw something that left me speechless. The box was there, intact, as if it had never been touched. But what really scared me was what was around her. All the letters, the photos, spread out in a perfect circle. In the center, the box was open but empty. There was nothing else inside. The feeling of being watched came back with full force. and I knew I had to get out of there. I ran to the car without looking back, certain that something was following me. Since that day, I have never seen Paul again, and Luke has moved to another city. To this day, I don't know what that box was, but I do know that since we found it, nothing in my life has been the same. The sound of underground. That week, we were working on the excavation of an area that would be the parking lot for a new building. The day had started like any other. Dust, noise of machines, and sparse conversations among workers. I was responsible for monitoring the security of the site, so I spent a lot of time checking equipment and guiding the team. It was in the afternoon that everything started. We were taking a break when we first heard the sound. It sounded like the sound of hammering, but the problem was that it came from underground, an area that was not yet accessible. At first, we thought it was some echo of the machines that were running on the upper level. One of the guys even joked that we should have woken up the ghosts of the place. Everyone laughed, but deep down, I could feel that it bothered me. After that, the sounds started to get more frequent, always coming from the same direction. They were rhythmic beats, sometimes stronger, sometimes more spaced, but always coming from below where we were. I went to the engineer in charge to report, and he suggested it was some kind of leak or structural problem, then stopped the machines to investigate. As we went down to inspect, the silence was absolute. None of the beats were happening while we were there. We did a thorough check, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We went back to work trying to forget, but the next day, it became even more strange. The tools began to disappear. First it was a hammer, then a shovel, and then one of the smaller generators disappeared without a trace. We tried to justify it as carelessness, but I could feel the mood getting tense. The sound of underground. That week, we were working on the excavation of an area that would be the parking lot for a new building. The day had started like any other. Dust, noise of machines, and sparse conversations among workers. I was responsible for monitoring the security of the site, so I spent a lot of time checking equipment and guiding the team. It was in the afternoon that everything started. We were taking a break when we first heard the sound. It sounded like the sound of hammering, but the problem was that it came from underground, an area that was not yet accessible. At first, we thought it was some echo of the machines that were running on the upper level. One of the guys even joked that we should have woken up the ghosts of the place. Everyone laughed, but deep down, I could feel that it bothered me. After that, the sounds started to get more frequent, always coming from the same direction. They were rhythmic beats, sometimes stronger, sometimes more spaced, but always coming from below where we were. I went to the engineer in charge to report, and he suggested it was some kind of leak or structural problem, then stopped the machines to investigate. As we went down to inspect, the silence was absolute. None of the beats were happening while we were there. We did a thorough check, but found nothing out of the ordinary. We went back to work trying to forget, but the next day, it became even more strange. The tools began to disappear. First it was a hammer, then a shovel, and then one of the smaller generators disappeared without a trace. We tried to justify it as carelessness, but I could feel the mood getting tense. Went with him to the site, trying to understand what it meant. The hole did not seem natural, but also had no sign of tools. It was small, but deep enough to look like a tunnel starting to form. Carlos suggested that it might be an animal, but there were no footprints or signs of loose land around. As we get closer, we feel a strange smell, metallic and heavy, coming from inside. We stood there, staring at that opening, when suddenly we heard again, the hammered. Only this time, they came from inside the hole. My body froze, and Carlos looked at me with his eyes wide open. Don't know what happened to us, but we ran out of there without saying a word, as if something pushed us away. After running out of that hole, me and Carlos did not talk about what happened until the end of the day. You could see that he was as shaken as I am. When the day was over, we met with the rest of the team to discuss the disappearance of Tiago and the sounds. It was then that Joel, the more experienced guy, told something that left everyone silent. He said that he had worked on a job years ago where similar sounds began to appear out of nowhere, and something like this happened. Tools disappearing, and then one of the workers disappeared. His story seemed absurd, but in the situation we were in, no one had the courage to laugh. He ended up saying, "If I were you, I'd stay away from that hole." That night, the sound of hammering became unbearable. I was lying at home trying to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I seemed to hear those rhythmic beats, as if echoing in my head. I tried to convince myself that it was paranoia, but then I got an audio message from Carlos, completely out of it. He said that he was hearing the sounds inside his own house, as if they came from the ground. I asked him to calm down and went there to see what was happening. When I arrived, he was sitting in the room, pale-faced, pointing to the floor. "Don't you hear?" he asked. And suddenly I heard a low, rhythmic sound, as if someone was hammering the side under the house. It didn't make sense, but at that moment I realized that it wasn't going to stop anytime soon. After hearing the sound in Carlos' house, I was completely bewildered. He did not want to stay there anymore, and I also did not know what to say to reassure him. We went back together to work. It was already early morning, because we needed to see the hole again. It didn't seem like a sensible idea, but something pulled us there, as if the only way to understand was by facing. When we arrived, the bed was empty, as expected. The security lights partially illuminated the place, creating strange shadows that only increased the tension. We walked towards the hole, and, before we even got close, heard the hammering again. This time, higher, almost like an echo coming from all sides. When we finally got closer, we realized that the hole was different. It had grown. Now it was big enough for a person to pass through, and the metallic smell was even stronger. I felt my throat dry, and Carlos started to back off, mumbling that it was not normal. It was then we saw something move inside. It was not clear enough to identify, but it looked like a shadow that moved slowly and heavily, as if trying to get out. We stood still, without reaction, while the sound of the hammering was so loud that it seemed to be vibrating in the air. I do not know what happened next. My body reacted before my mind understood, and we ran out of there as fast as we could. After running out of the construction site, we stopped on the sidewalk of the street, completely breathless. Carlos could not speak, and I felt my heart beating so hard that it seemed to explode. We stood there for a few minutes, trying to understand what we had just seen. It was impossible to rationalize. The sound of the hammering still seemed to echo in my head, even though I was far from the hole. I took my phone and tried to call the engineer in charge to tell what was happening, but the phone did not complete the call. Carlos suggested that we call the police, but what would we say? That there was something coming out of a hole in the construction? It seemed absurd even to me. The next morning, when we finally got the courage to come back, something had changed. The hole was sealed. Someone or something had completely filled the opening with earth and concrete. There was no explanation, Nobody on the team knew how or when it had been done, and the marks we had seen the night before disappeared. The engineer appeared hours later and ordered work to continue, as if nothing had happened. But the sound stopped. Everything was strangely quiet, and Tiago was never found again. Even today, when I walk near that work, I feel a strange shiver, as if something was still there waiting. I never worked in excavations again. After that experience, I realized some things underground should remain buried. The masked vigilante. That morning, I woke up with a strange noise coming from the street. It was not something very loud, but it sounded like something being dragged on the asphalt. I looked out the bedroom window and saw a man standing in front of the house next door, with a mask covering his entire face and a spray can in his hand. He was painting something on the door of my neighbor's house, fast and precise movements. I stood there watching, not understanding what was happening. My first reaction was to think it was some kind of vandalism or stupid joke teenagers. But there was something about his posture, the way he moved, that made me uncomfortable. It was as if he knew exactly what he was doing, without haste but with a kind of purpose. I decided to go out and confront him. I took a flashlight and went down to the door, opening it slowly so as not to make too much noise. When I stepped out, he was already staring at me. It was as if he knew I was there all the time. Before I could say anything, he just started walking towards my house. I did not run, did not scream. I was frozen on the sidewalk as he approached. He lifted the spray can and started marking my door with the same paint. I remember clearly the phrase he whispered, almost as a warning, "You are not safe here." His voice was low, almost hoarse, and echoed in my head even after he disappeared down the street. There was no anger or threat in his tone, but that was enough to make me come running in and lock all the doors. The next morning, when I opened the door, the warning was there in big black letters, a strange symbol that I did not recognize, as if they were two circles connected by lines, and the phrase, "You are not safe here," written below. I looked around to see if anyone else in the neighborhood had seen it, but the street was quiet, almost deserted. Went to my neighbor's house, which had also been marked, and I noticed that they hadn't left yet. I rang the doorbell, but no one answered. The door was ajar open, which was strange because they never let it go. I didn't want to invade, but something in it made me uncomfortable. I came home, trying to ignore the symbol on my door, but the feeling that something was out of the ordinary did not leave me alone. Around noon, I heard the sound of sirens. I looked out the window and saw an ambulance and a police car parked in front of my neighbor's house. I went there to see what was going on and found a small crowd forming. A policeman stopped me from getting too close, but I could hear parts of what was being said. Apparently, the family father had suffered a strange accident during the early morning. Something about him falling down the stairs and banging his head. But the way neighbors commented with suspicious looks made me think there was more to the story. The symbol marked on their door remained there, untouched, as if it were a signature. That gave me a shiver. As absurd as it seemed, I could not get the idea out of my head that the masked man had something to do with it. After the accident at my neighbor's house, the whole neighborhood looked different. It was as if everyone were walking on eggshells, avoiding talking about what happened. The marks on the doors remained there, both on mine and theirs, and no one seemed willing to clean them. I couldn't stop thinking about what the masked man had said. "You're not safe here." Who is he? And why did he mark our homes? I spent the rest of the day trying to find some logical explanation. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That a man showed up in the middle of the morning, painted my door, and then disappeared. It didn't seem like the kind of thing that anyone would take seriously. That night, the tension increased even more. He was lying down, trying to fall asleep, when I heard that noise again, the same sound of something being dragged on the asphalt. I jumped out of bed and went straight to the window. There he was, standing on the sidewalk, this time looking directly at my house. He was doing nothing, just standing still, with the mask covering his face and the same spray can in hand. My heart popped. I thought about calling someone, but who? I didn't want to risk opening the door again. I stood there motionless until he started moving. Not towards my house, but to another one further down the street. I saw when he started marking the door of the next house, just as he had done with mine and that of my neighbors. It was then that I realized that it would not stop. After seeing him mark the door of the next house, I became even more restless. Why was he choosing those houses? What did it mean? I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I spent hours sitting in the living room, looking out the window and trying to imagine what might be behind it. The next morning, I saw the new mark on the door of the house ahead. It was the same strange symbol and the repeated phrase, "You are not safe here." During the day, I tried to talk with some neighbors, but nobody seemed to know or want to talk about the masked man. Some pretended not to have noticed the marks. Others looked away quickly, as if ignoring that was enough to ward off the problem. But you could feel that everyone was afraid. That afternoon, something happened that made everything even stranger. A truck stopped in front of the house that had been marked the night before. It was a couple who, as far as I knew, had been living there for a few months. I saw the man leaving in a hurry and entering the house. He didn't give 5 minutes, and he left again, carrying a suitcase. The woman soon followed him, also with a tense expression and carrying more luggage. They got into the truck and left, without saying a word to anyone. Later, I heard a neighbor comment that the couple had said they were leaving for security reasons. Security of what? I didn't know, but the feeling that the masked man was behind it only increased. He seemed to bring something with him, something that no one could explain. After the couple left, the feeling of tension in the neighborhood became even stronger. It was as if everyone was waiting for the next move, the next warning. I spent the whole day with that feeling of being watched, even inside my own home. When night fell, I locked all the doors and windows, but that did not help ease the fear. Around midnight, I heard a noise coming from the street, but this time it was not the sound of the spray can. It was something sharper, like metal scraping against metal. My heart shot, and I ran to the window. There he was again, the masked man, but now he wasn't alone. Another figure, also wearing a mask, was standing next to him. They seemed to be moving something on the sidewalk. This time, curiosity was stronger than fear. Took my phone, put it in my pocket, and went out the back door, trying to get close without being seen. When I got close enough to see better, I realized that they were getting something on the ground, right in the middle of the street. It looked like a stake, with a piece of black cloth tied at the end. I was about to take a picture when I felt that shiver again, the same as the first time I saw it. Before I could react, one of them turned his head directly towards me. Don't know how he saw me, it was dark, and I was sure it was hidden. But he knew I was there. I was paralyzed, and all I could do was run back home, with the feeling that something much worse was about to happen. After running back home, I locked the door and leaned against it, trying to control my breathing. My heart was so fast I could hardly think. I looked out the window to see if they were still there, but the street was completely empty. The stake they had planted on the ground was still there, swaying slightly in the wind, with the black cloth attached to it. Didn't know what it meant, but it sounded like some kind of warning, as if they were marking the neighborhood in some way. I decided to take my cell phone and call the police, but I hesitated. What would I say? That two masked people were marking doors and poking strange objects in the street? Even if I could convince them to come, I knew those two would be gone before anyone else came. I spent the rest of the night in the clear, looking out the window, waiting for them to come back. When the sun rose, I had the courage to go out and see the stake up close. The street was deserted, and the silence was almost disturbing. When I approached the object, I saw that the black cloth was not just a piece of fabric. It was a bag, and inside it there was something that looked like paper. He sucked the ball carefully, and my stomach turned when I saw what was written. It was a list with names and addresses, and mine was at the end. My body froze. They knew who I was, where I lived, and probably who all the people in the neighborhood were. I ran home, sure it wasn't random. They were watching us, and now it seemed personal. After finding my name on the list, I came home completely terrified. I locked all the doors and windows once more and pulled all the curtains, as if that was enough to protect me. I spent hours trying to understand what it meant. Who were those people? Why were they marking our homes and leaving that kind of warning? The only thing I knew for sure was that I could not ignore it. Took the bag again and looked at the other names on the list. I recognized some as neighbors of the neighborhood, but others I had no idea who they could be. I called one of the closest neighbors who was also on the list, but the phone rang until it fell into the mailbox. The feeling of impotence was suffocating. Lonely neighbor. When it all happened, I had just moved into that house about 8 months ago. It was a quiet street, the kind where you know at least sight of the neighbors. The lady next door, however, was an exception. Never spoke to anyone, and the only time I saw her was the day I arrived. She was in the garden, standing among the plants that were already practically dead, wearing a faded dress that seemed to have been white one day. There was something strange about her. Maybe it was the way she looked directly at me without saying a word, before simply turning her back and entering. After that, I never saw her again, but sometimes I noticed the lights in the house turned on late at night. Some neighbors commented that she was a bit paranoid. They said that she had been living alone since her husband died, about 15 years ago, and that she was never the same. Over time, I got used to the silence coming from that house, until one day, I realized that the lights were not on anymore. The garden, which was already neglected, looked worse than ever, and mail began to accumulate in the mailbox. That's when the concern began. Other neighbors also noticed the disappearance, and, after a few days of discussions, we decided to go into the house to see if everything was okay. It was not an easy decision, but nobody had heard from her, and the police did not seem interested, since technically she had not been missing long enough. That evening, we went in three, me, Luis, and Dona Marta, who lived at the house on the corner and always were the informal leader of the neighborhood. The door was unlocked, which in itself was strange considering how reserved it seemed to be. When we entered, a strong smell of mold and something I could not identify took over. The inside of the house was as dark as the outside, curtains closed, old furniture covered with dust, and no sign that anyone had been living there for days, perhaps weeks. We called her name a few times, but the silence that came from the house seemed heavy, as if it was pushing us out. I was shivering just to be there. While Dona Marta tried to open the windows to let a little light in, Luis found the first pile of notebooks in a corner of the room. They were simple notebooks of those with black covers, but they were stacked with an almost obsessive care. We took one of them to see, and what was written left me speechless. They were detailed notes about me, my routine, the hours I went to work, what I bought at the supermarket, even things that I said on the phone inside the house. I was completely bewildered. How did she know that? Why was she writing these things down? Dona Marta and Luis opened other notebooks, and each had information about someone different from the neighborhood. It was as if she had spied on us all for years. After seeing what was written in the notebooks, I began to feel a restlessness that went beyond discomfort. That was too personal, as if my privacy had been taken away without me noticing. The notes included even details I never told anyone, like the password for an old account I used years ago. It was impossible for her to know this. I was so lost in my thoughts that I almost did not notice when Dona Marta caught our attention. She had found something else, a small recorder hidden under one of the furniture. When she pressed the play button, we heard voices, our voices. It was whole conversations recorded, from trivial discussions to secrets that no one else knew. It was surreal. Later that night, something happened that made me realize the worst was yet to come. I was sitting on the couch, with the TV turned on only to muffle the silence, when I heard footsteps outside. They were not hurried, but rhythmical, almost as if someone was deliberately warning me that I was there. I took my cell phone and went to the window, peeking through a crack in the curtain. There he was, the masked man, standing on my sidewalk, looking straight at my house. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were two more people with him, both wearing different masks, as if it was some kind of uniform. I was paralyzed, and all I could do was watch them stand there, motionless, staring at my house for several minutes before they simply turned around and disappeared into the darkness. Since then, I have never seen them again, but the marks on the doors remain, and the weight of what happened that week still haunts me. To this day, I can't sleep at all, afraid they'll come back. It was a muffled sound, as if something heavy had fallen. We didn't know if it was our imagination or if there really was someone up there, but none of us had the courage to go up and check. Luis insisted that we should leave immediately, and this time we all agreed. As soon as we left, we locked the door of the house with the key that we found on the floor of the room and went straight to the house of Marta, where we called the police. Whatever was in that house, we didn't want to be part of it anymore. When the police arrived, we explained everything, the photos, the notebooks, the recorder. They seemed skeptical at first, as if we were exaggerating. But as soon as they entered the house and saw the walls covered with pictures and the notebooks scattered, the tone changed completely. One of the officers came back to inform us that they would do a more detailed investigation, but that for now there was no sign of where the lady might be. The house was empty, no clothes, documents, or anything that would indicate she had left on her own. It was as if she had disappeared into the air. I asked if they had found anything upstairs, where we heard the noise before leaving, but the policeman just shook his head and said there was nothing there. The following days were strange. Even with the house sealed by the police, no one in the neighborhood felt safe. Many began installing security cameras and alarms, but this did not help to ease the fear. The feeling of being observed was still there, especially at night. I started noticing little things in my house that didn't make sense. A window that I was sure to have closed open in the morning, objects out of place, muffled steps during the early hours. At first I thought it was paranoia, but the feeling was so real that I started sleeping with a knife by my bed. I could never really relax. As much as time has passed, we still cannot explain. The police never found the lady, nor could they trace the origin of the recordings or photos. Her house was sold a few months later, and the new residents seemed to care nothing about what happened there before. I tried to move on, but the feeling of being watched never completely disappeared. Sometimes I still have the impression of seeing a shadow in my bedroom window or hearing that muffled sound coming from upstairs. Don't know if it's my imagination or something else. I just know that since that day, my life has never been the same. The woman in the basement. At the time, I was 26 and trying to lead a healthier life, so I started running in the mornings. It wasn't exactly a regular habit, but on that particular day, I decided to leave earlier than usual, around 6 a.m. The street where I lived was quiet, with few houses and a wooded area that gave an almost rural touch to the neighborhood. Remember that the day was starting to clear, and the only thing I heard were my own steps on the asphalt and the sound of birds beginning to sing. It was one of those moments when you really feel at peace, as if nothing bad could happen. I hardly knew how much this would change in a matter of minutes. As I ran down the main street, I passed an old house, one with peeled paint and small windows. I knew it was empty for months, maybe even years. Whenever I passed by there, I felt a strange shiver, but that day something was different. When I got close, I heard a sound that made me stop instantly, muffled screams, as if they came from inside the house. My heart popped, and my first reaction was to think someone needed help. I approached slowly, trying to hear better, and I noticed that the screams came from the basement. The door to that was half open, swaying slightly with the wind. Against all logic, I decided to look closer. I approached the cellar door with my heart in my throat. Each step seemed a challenge, and my mind was divided between the will to help and the fear of what I could find there. When I got close enough, I pushed the door slowly and saw a ladder of old wood that went down to a dark basement. The smell was strong, a mixture of mold and something metallic I could not identify. Then I saw her. A woman was sitting on the floor, with her arms tied behind her back and an expression of pure despair on her face. She was not screaming anymore, but as soon as she saw me, she began to beg for help. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but full of panic. "Please get me out of here," she said repeatedly. I was frozen for a second, not knowing what to do. She looked in a state of shock, with shaggy hair and a deep cut on the arm that was still bleeding. Told her I would get help and ran, my legs almost failing from so much nervousness. I ran to the nearest neighbor's house, knocking on the door like a madman, but no one answered. I took my phone and called the police, trying to explain what was happening, but my voice trembled so much that it seemed even I did not believe the story. I went back to the basement, determined to stay with the woman until someone arrived, but when I went back, she was no longer there. The place was empty, as if there had never been anyone there. I stood there, looking into the empty basement, trying to process what was happening. The rope that had previously tied her arms was on the ground, but there was no sign of blood, nor anything to indicate that anyone had been there. Ran up the stairs and looked around the house, but everything was the same as before, abandoned and quiet. It was when I heard the police siren in the distance, and for a moment I felt relieved. At least now I would have someone to confirm what I saw, or at least help understand what was happening. When the police arrived, I explained everything from the screams to the woman asking for help and her disappearance. The 2 policemen came into the house with me, while a third one stayed outside. I showed the basement and the place where I had seen the woman, but they seemed more skeptical every minute. They searched the place with lanterns and found nothing, only the rope on the ground, which one of them dismissed as probably left by someone who used the basement as a storage. I tried to argue, but they just took my statement and said they would make a report. After they left, I stood there for a while, feeling a mixture of frustration and fear. I began to wonder if my mind was playing tricks, but deep down I knew what I had seen. That woman was there, and she was terrified. After the cops left, the feeling of relief I had hoped for never came. Instead, I got the impression that something was wrong, that the story wasn't over. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince myself that maybe I had overdone it, that the woman could have escaped on her own, or that I was confusing things. But as night fell, my nervousness increased. Every sound, every shadow cast by the street light made me jump in fear. Around 11 o'clock, I heard something that made me freeze. Steps. They were light, but clearly coming from the sidewalk in front of my house. I waited for it to pass, but the steps stopped right in front of my gate. I slowly got up and went to the window, peeking through the curtains. There was no one there, but the sound of footsteps continued, as if they were circulating around the house. Tried to convince myself that it could be just a dog or maybe the wind, but there was something strange about it. It was rhythmic, as if someone was walking with a purpose. Took my phone and turned on the camera to record, hoping to capture anything that explained what was happening. But as soon as I started filming, the steps stopped suddenly. The silence that followed was worse than the sound of the steps. It was as if something was waiting for me, hidden in the darkness. I stood in the room, holding my phone as if it could protect me. The silence outside was oppressive, almost suffocating. I decided to turn on the backyard light to try to see better, but as soon as I pressed the switch, something slammed into the window next to me. It was a dry sound, as if a hand had struck the glass. My heart almost stopped, and I froze in place. I waited a few seconds before looking, trying to prepare for whatever it was. When I finally got closer and looked out, there was nothing, only the empty yard, with the wind swinging the branches of trees. But the glass was blurred, as if someone had actually stood there a few seconds ago. At that moment, the adrenaline took over. I called the police again, trying to explain that someone was around my house, but the answer was discouraging. "We will send a car to take a look." While I waited, I sat on the floor of the room, with my back against the wall, staring at the window as if it was going to come alive at any moment. About 20 minutes later, the lights of a car lit up my street. 2 officers came down, did a quick tour of the yard, and returned saying there was nothing wrong. But before they left, one of them pointed out something I had not noticed. On the fence in the yard, there were marks of hands, as if someone had gone by there supporting themselves. But before they left, one of them pointed out something I had not noticed. On the fence in the yard, there were marks of hands, as if someone had gone by there supporting themselves. The fingerprint on the gate was fresh, so real that I could feel the fear growing again. To this day, I don't know who the woman in the basement was or who was haunting me that night, but something tells me the two things are connected. The island of treatment. This happened about 2 years ago, but I still remember every detail as if it had happened yesterday. At the time, I was desperate. He had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease, and none of the traditional treatments seemed to work. I spent months going from doctor to doctor, spending what I had and what I didn't have, until one of them mentioned an experimental program on a remote island. According to him, it was a unique opportunity. a cutting-edge clinic with highly qualified professionals and state-of-the-art technology, all covered by a kind of medical bag. The only condition was that I would have to spend 3 months on the island, isolated from the outside world. I accepted without hesitation. The arrival was exactly as I expected. Everything seemed perfect. The island had an amazing view, with a modern clinic surrounded by a landscape that seemed to have come out of a tourism catalog. The other patients seemed to be in the same situation as me, a diverse group of people, each with their own history of fighting against rare or incurable diseases. In the first days, everything went well. I was subjected to a battery of tests and had daily consultations with doctors who seemed to know exactly what they were doing. We received balanced meals, had schedules for light physical activities, and even meditation sessions. It was hard to believe that something could go wrong there. In the first few weeks, everything seemed to go as planned. I felt more willing, perhaps by organized routine and controlled feeding. The doctors and nurses were always friendly, but there was something curious. They never gave details about the progress of treatment. When we asked about results or what exactly they were testing, the answers were always vague, something like protocol is confidential or we are still analyzing the data. At first, nobody questioned much. We were all grateful to be there, but the atmosphere began to change when the first patients started disappearing. The first was a man named Gabriel. He was friendly and talked to everyone. He was there to treat a serious respiratory condition and said that he felt some improvements. One night during dinner, he commented that the doctors asked for extra tests and that they might adjust the treatment. The next day, he did not show up for any meal. We asked the staff, but they only said that he needed additional care. When we asked where he was, the answers were always cut off, as if no one had permission to speak. An older patient, Dona Vera, commented that this had already happened to others before our arrival. That's when I started paying more attention. In the third week, I started to notice some strange things. Despite all the healthy routine, I didn't really feel better. In fact, some symptoms seemed to be coming back. I discussed this with one of the doctors during a consultation, but he just smiled and said it was part of the detox process. I found the answer vague, but decided not to insist. However, I was not the only one to realize that something was wrong. A patient named Carla, who suffered from chronic migraines, mentioned that her pain was getting worse. Other patients also began to report similar symptoms, but we always received the same evasive responses from doctors. It was then that another person disappeared. A gentleman named Antonio, who was always in good spirits despite his heart condition. One day he was with us at breakfast, telling stories of his youth. The next day, he just didn't show up. When we asked the staff, they said he had been transferred to a special ward for monitoring. But nobody knew where this ward was, and none of the areas we had access to looked different. Unrest began to grow among us. Some suggested that we should look for answers, but the environment was so controlled that we didn't know where to start. That night, a small group of patients decided to meet in my room to talk. There were 4 of us, me, Carla, Dona Vera, and a boy named Daniel, who was there to treat a rare skin disease. Everyone was suspicious, and each had a strange story to share. Carla said she heard voices coming from a corridor that should be empty, while Dona Vera claimed she saw something being carried on a covered stretcher late at night. Daniel, on the other hand, was convinced that the daily exams were more than just checkups. He said that he once woke up earlier than expected after a sedative, and saw one of the doctors talking to someone through a headset. The conversation didn't make sense, but it seemed they were reporting data about him. We decided that the next night we would try to explore the clinic. It was not easy to wait until the time when the corridors were quiet. The security guards, who we initially thought were there to protect patients, now seemed more interested in watching our movements. Around midnight, Carla and Daniel came to my room, while Donna Vera was watching in the corridor. We left slowly, trying not to make noise, and began to explore areas that until then we had no access. We found locked doors and corridors leading nowhere. But then, at the end of a corridor, we found a different door. It was unlocked, and when we opened it, we came across something that froze us to the bone. Behind that door was a completely different room from the rest of the clinic. It was not clean, bright, and organized like the areas where we spent the day. The place was dark, with stained concrete walls and the strong smell of something chemical in the air. In the center, there was a row of marks, and on them, medical equipment that seemed outdated, almost improvised. Some of the marks had marks of something heavy, as if someone had been tied up there. Daniel tried to turn on the main light, but a weak lamp blinked and only made the environment more sinister. It was then that we saw something that no one could ignore: bottles labeled with codes and our initials. Each vial seemed to contain samples of blood or some other fluid that we could not identify. While Carla was picking up one of the bottles to try and understand, we heard a noise coming from the corridor. They were steps and did not seem to be from a patient. We were paralyzed, trying to decide what to do. The steps stopped right at the entrance of the room. Luckily, the door had a small frosted glass window, so we could see only one shadow moving. It was someone tall, wearing a lab coat. The person stood there for a few seconds, as if he knew we were inside, but then the steps started again, moving away. As soon as the sound disappeared, we all agreed that it was time to get out of there. We took what we got, including one of the bottles and some notes papers that were on a table, and ran back to the rooms. When we returned to the rooms, we were panting and completely silent. No one knew exactly what to say. We were terrified, but at the same time felt that we had discovered something important. Daniel opened the papers we took and started reading, while Carla examined the bottle we brought. The notes were confusing, full of medical terms that no one understood there, but some words stood out: active monitoring, final phase, and most frightening of all, replacement. That seemed to confirm what we already suspected. We were not there to be treated, but for some kind of experiment. Perhaps the disappearances were part of this process. We decided that we couldn't wait any longer. That same night, we would have to find a way off the island. We planned to go to the port at dawn, where we knew there were supply boats that arrived regularly. But before dawn, things got even stranger. Around 4 a.m., an alarm started ringing in the clinic. It was not the fire alarm, but something more serious, with a high-pitched and repetitive tone. The lights started to flash, and we heard voices in the corridor as if the staff were mobilizing. When we opened the bedroom door, we saw nurses running from one side to the other, some carrying equipment. We took advantage of the confusion to mix and run towards the main exit. We managed to get to the main exit, but it was blocked by 2 security guards. It didn't seem like they were just controlling the situation. They were clearly there to stop anyone from leaving. We decided to change direction and go to the opposite side towards the port. By this time, the alarm was still ringing, and the chaos in the clinic seemed to be behind. The way to the port was illuminated only by the dim light of scattered poles, and each step seemed heavier than the previous. When we finally saw the boats, our hope was renewed, but soon we realized that there were 2 more guards near them. It was as if they knew that someone would try to escape. We hid behind a shed while deciding what to do. Carla was shaking, and Daniel tried to keep calm, but the despair was evident in all of us. It was then that Dona Vera pointed out something we had ignored: a small boat tied to one of the piers, with no one around. We decided that this was our only chance. While Daniel and I ran to untie the boat, Carla and Dona Vera were on watch. Everything seemed to be working until we heard a scream coming from the clinic direction. It was not a cry from someone in distress. It looked more non-human. That scared us even more, and we jumped on the boat without looking back. We paddled with all the strength we had, even without knowing exactly where we were going. The island seemed to move away too slowly, and the sound of the alarm still echoed in the distance. Daniel, who was closer to the stern, turned back for a moment and became pale. "There's someone on the edge," he whispered, but the dread in his voice was enough to make us scared. No one had the courage to look. We just keep rowing, with the adrenaline driving us to each stroke of the paddle in the water. When we finally reached a safe distance, the alarm sound disappeared and everything became incredibly quiet. The kind of silence that brings not relief, but tension. Hours later, we were rescued by a fishing boat. We tried to explain what had happened, but the fishermen seemed more concerned about taking us back to shore. When we finally stepped on land, we decided to go to the police. We told them everything: the disappearances, the room we found, the alarm. They promised to investigate, but we never had concrete news. We found out some time later that the clinic was deactivated and that the island was officially abandoned. To this day, we do not know what really happened there or what those notes meant. We only know that we escaped by a little and that something very wrong was happening on that island. And sometimes I still have nightmares about that cry we heard before leaving.